All right, so we're live now. I think people will be jumping on the call as we go. So you can see at the bottom of the screen, you can see the listener coming in. We got all the panelists on here today. So I would like to, first of all, thanks for everyone and good morning or good evening, wherever you guys are logged in from, and making the time to come here and listen to us. It'll be an interesting conversation for next an hour. We'll be diving into BIM LODs. I think there's a lot of kind of misconception. At the same time, there's lack of understanding against BIM LOD and how we use that in industry. So some of those might be cleared, but at least we'll try to shower some light upon. I think we got a great panel from different perspective, different backgrounds. We have Will, who is from engineering background, David from GC background, and Brian as architecture, and myself from subcontractor. So to just begin with, I would like to have an introduction round for the panelists. One by one, we go through it, and if you guys can introduce yourself, then we'll start jumping into the discussion itself. So Will, if you want to introduce yourself.
Oh, thank you very much, Ani, and it's an honor to get to be here with Brian and David. I'm a principal at Eichert Consulting, and our firm works both in design and construction consulting and engineering, civil structure, and enclosure engineering. And in the reality capture space, we have a team that works in that area, as well as building information modeling and virtual design and construction consulting. And with that, I'll pass it on to Brian.
Sure. Hey, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. And thank you, Ani, Will, David. It's great to be on this panel with such smart people and friends. So I'm Brian Pravda, principal architect of Pravda Architecture and Design. We're a boutique architecture and interior design firm in South Florida, and we specialize in creating healthy environments. So I'm a well AP, and that's one of our strengths, as well as our advanced technology. It's a real differentiator from other firms, and really we're committed to providing the best high quality service and quality drawings and everything on all of our projects for our clients. And so part of that is ensuring that we're on top of our game when it comes to technology and BIM and everything like that. So thanks so much, and I'll pass it on to David.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Ani and Will and Brian, for having me on the panel with you guys. My name is David Thorowell. I'm Director of Operational Excellence at Styles Construction. We're a mid-sized Florida-based construction company with a couple projects in Nashville and in North Carolina. My background is largely in architecture for my undergrad with University of Florida, go Gators, and also finally graduated architecture and saw the light and switched over to BCN, or building construction, also at the University of Florida, and spent the past 15 years in industry, focusing primarily on BIM and VDC and how we can deliver projects better to our clients and hopefully make more profit or pick up efficiencies in the field, as well as in the planning stages. So again, thank you everyone for joining our panel.
Perfect. Well, I will introduce myself as well. So my name is Ani. Basically come from concrete background, and same as David, I went to University of Florida in 2013-14, graduated, and then joined Baker Concrete, where currently I am right now as a BIM VDC manager. So I basically, same boat as what David was talking, fell in love with BIM and started diving into directly right from the college days and started heading that direction. So far it's been wonderful journey. We've been learning quite a bit of it. Recently, I've jumping into like more of how can we simplify construction, and I think that's what this panel is all about today. I posted a couple of weeks ago. I posted a post regarding BIM LOD, comparing it with how we make Subway sandwiches, and I think a lot of people really loved it, the concept of it, and from that point, I was thinking that we might need to have a little bit more light on this subject. Obviously, BIM LODs are really important in our industry, and we need to understand it more. A lot of people, especially the youngcomers that are coming in BIM and industry, they don't understand what exactly LODs are for. Yeah, they're thrown away as a requirement, but we don't really get the underlying concept about it. So that's why we thought to get together and kind of present this to all of you guys. We're also recording this, so towards the end of it, we'll kind of publish it online and have it everybody to listen it. The way that we want to do it right now is kind of jump into question round by each one of you guys and hear your insight on what BIM LODs, where it's come from. But at the end of the discussion, we'll have a Q&A round. So for all the listener out there, if you guys have question, keep your question ready. So we might be able to answer some of your question at the last minute. And the way you do it is just raise your hand. So I have your list, whoever have question ready. And at the last 10 minutes, we'll invite you on the stage and ask the question to any panelist that you ask. So just jumping right into it, I think my first question would be going to Will. So Will, obviously you're the one that kind of was one of the first writers of LODs. You have a lot of other people that were involved in LOD, but I think you had a lot of insight. So I would like to ask a question about where it all started from. Like, what is the brief history, if you can provide, about BIM LOD,
Sure.
What its origin, and then why it exists in first place?
Oh, thank you, Ani. It's a very good question, and I think it's important to give just a couple minutes on background and kind of where my perspective in giving this. I was able to start in '92 at an early admittance program in a math and science program at the University of North Texas, and in '94 they didn't have engineering there at UNT at the time, and I switched to Washington University in St. Louis, and the focus of the area I was in was in structures, and I did my undergrad in civil and my master's in structures at the time. But the graduate work was working on 3D parametric modeling. And I give those as background in that in '92, there weren't student emails. You registered for classes at UNT, paper-based, you went to the Coliseum and waited in line. Just registering for classes was a 6+ hour ordeal. By '94, when I got to St. Louis, we had our first email addresses as students. And by '95, we were doing web-based online registration for classes. In 30 minutes, you could register for class, what used to be an all-day event. And so at the time when I was doing my research in parametric modeling, there was an aerospace manufacturer there, and I would find engineers working at that facility, interviewed them. Some of them are still my mentors today. I still keep up with. But at the time, they were, I remember very distinctly in the mid-'90s talking to engineers working on a very common fighter jet at the time, doing stereolithography of the front landing gear systems. They showed me parts of how they were 3D printed, talked about the modeling demands, and you really needed three common things. You needed a common platform, bandwidth, and computer power. And aerospace manufacturers had that all under one roof, and that's what allowed them to progress with using parametric modeling. But then they had the challenge on, what can I rely on these model elements for? And what do I need to have in them for right of reliance of that element to facilitate what I'm doing? Additionally, they were using laser scanning on fuselages and such technology. And it was an amazing time for me to really see aerospace as an archetype of what the building industry could be. And that's what really sparked my interest in seeing this whole concept of right of reliance of elements and models being critical. Fast forwarding, as the building industry started applying this, there were many early adopters trying to find ways to define in the building industry, how do we show right of reliance of an element? And 2008 is when AIA came out with its LOD framework, spearheaded by groups in California with the California regional AIA groups leading that way. And there are a lot of people involved in that piece. And when that came out, there were times in around '08, '09, 2010, I was presenting papers at Autodesk University and other places on the challenge between design to construction. And the original '08 AIA definitions had this 300 to 400, I called it a chasm. And that's where a lot of the work I was doing and publishing at the time on 350 was getting some traction, because it represented a distinct need. If you think about the built environment, 90% of the money in construction gets mobilized and actuated between LOD 300 and 400 for an element. That's when it goes from theory to reality in the real world. And that's a real giant leap of what happens from 300 to 400. So 350 served a role in, I called it originally cross-trade coordination. And I had been working in leadership with the AGC BIM Forum since '08. And in 2012 presented the concept of 350 to what was emerging as a LOD working group. And that got ratified in the 2013 LOD spec. It was the AGC BIM Forum LOD spec. AIA updated their LOD definitions in 13, but just due to timing, they did not have 350 yet. And since being at the BIM Forum leadership all the way through the start of this year, I have stepped down from the board early this year. I've worked in that area of LOD. AGC had my firm do all the original editing on the first versions of the LOD spec, and most of the graphics in that spec were created by our firm. And where that leads today is circling back on the history and background of this and why it's so important. Is those that are older than me are running companies, signing contracts. They came out with a problem-solving philosophy that's completely analog, and that's how they got out of college and started their careers. And those that graduated after '93 assume that you'll have a relational database solution as part of your problem solving. And so some of those who are the older generation, they get bored in discussions of LOD and models and things of this such. But I'd submit to you the real importance in this is that these contracts that they're writing and signing are committing their firms to scope, schedule, and fee requirements. And it's also how these firms are going to get sued. And LOD is at the heart of how you write and memorialize the scope, schedule, and fee of BIM. And over the last 10 years, another part of our, of areas I've worked in has been on construction litigation for BIM cases. And that's a new emerging area. And there's a common theme into them that LOD continues to be at the center of those litigation cases. And for those reasons alone, I think I really want to commend you on tackling this topic and trying to mystify it and simplify it. But with that, I want to hand it over to some of the other speakers.
Sure. I appreciate. I think that was great insight on the brief history about where the LOD started with. You mentioned 2008. That was the time I was an undergrad, so I had no clue what going on in the industry in terms of BIM LOD and whatnot. But I think it's really important to understand, as you mentioned, that a lot of the companies are making it contractual now, and then these are getting involved in legal matter that you have to hold these LODs. So understanding those are really important. I would switch it really quickly to David now and kind of understand a little bit about, like, from general contractor perspective, that how you guys use BIM LOD and how you put them in the contract, and then how do you hold people accountable using that? And also, like, how do you even explain all the LODs with all the different contracts involved in there?
Okay, so that's a pretty extravagant question, but I think it's very appropriate, and there's a lot of, like you said, there's a lot of misconceptions about what it's about. And I just wanted to tell Will, I joined BIM Forum in '07 at the Pinehurst BIM Forum, and that was pretty much my first foray into BIM as a labeled pursuit. Was in 3D modeling before that. And it was pretty interesting times back then, pretty heated discussions. And even though LOD seems to be the biggest thing that had legs over time, that was and still is a pretty formative group of people that were around back then. And I remember some pretty heated discussions with a lot of the architects, particularly in the group, arguing for AIA, and a fair number of lawyers in the group as well. So it was pretty exciting. And LOD was really an advancement coming out of there that affects us pretty heavily today. And in the GC perspective, one of our biggest concerns was writing these very elaborate BIM execution plans that had to go into very prescriptive protocols of what we were expecting people to model, especially subcontractors. Of course, back in the early days, I was actually outsourcing and modeling every trade myself, because down here in South Florida, at least, there weren't any subcontractors modeling. So there was, when we did start getting subcontractors on board, conveying what we needed them to do, on top of all the technical requirements, the scope requirements became pretty onerous. Obviously, you kind of sort it out on a one-on-one basis in a meeting verbally, but there really wasn't anything contractual to hold them, or even convey what we were talking about. So the LOD spec, being that it describes from, as Will was saying, the 100 to 400 at the time, or 100 to 500 on the AIA, left that giant chasm between 300, which is basically the end of, to simplify it, is the end of design, where a lot of your elements are very generic, essentially placeholders. And this is where people get confused, is that that's really critical that they are LOD 300, because most of our projects stay generic as a basis of design, most of the elements on the project, until they get bought out by a particular subcontractor and awarded. And then they bring in particular brands and particular models of elements and the specific geometries associated with those. So the 300, it's very critical for the industry to keep that as a looser standard for object definitions, as it's defined in the LOD spec, so that when we do award it and it becomes an actual brand of element, say an elevator, they're not interchangeable. So Kone has different size requirements for their hoistways and pits and everything else than ThyssenKrupp or Schindler do. So when we buy those elements out, that's when they need to start on their path to 400, where it's just defined pretty prescriptively in the LOD spec, exactly what you need. And basically, I call it nuts and bolts. It's very, very detailed description of those elements for fabrication. And I do want to clarify, it says fabrication in general, but we're not talking about the internal mechanisms of every motor. We're talking about fabrication of what would actually be fabricated.
How would you build it, basically?
How it affects the building process, right? So we're not talking engineering type modeling, at least not in terms of the insides. Yeah. But the giant chasm comes between that generic element and that very, very, very specific element, and being able to convey to a subcontractor what we need them to do. And that's where, when Will was passing around the BIM Forum spec originally, Rob Sloyer, a friend of mine, a close friend of all of ours, and I were having a conversation in the process of giving feedback, and said, we really need something in here that we don't really care about the 400 level nuts and bolts. That's up to the subcontractor. That's their purview. Because of computer power and everything else, we really don't need that level of detail or level of development. Kind of same concept in this particular case. But what we do need is we need to show hangers and connections and all these things to relatively generic elements so that we can coordinate. And so for the purposes of coordination, we really don't want 400 level, at least as it's defined.
Yeah.
We need to capture the timeliness of the process. And so that's kind of I actually just so happened to be meeting with Will and having a good conversation and before the actual spec came out. And I think I like to think that we influenced him a little bit on conveying some ideas toward that end. But yeah, that's how I write my contracts to this day. Is we tell the subcontractors, ultimately you're going to need to go through coordination with us, and ultimately produce your shop drawings from that coordinated model, not from some disparate process that goes on the side. And so ultimately you need 400, and for the sake of time, we need you to produce a 350 model that just has elements in it that need to be coordinated, that will impact the coordination process.
Yeah.
So again, for instance, hangers are one of the most critical things for us to get in our models, because those hangers on a pipe set per se or duct are likely going to go through another system if not coordinated with it. So that's really how, short story long, of how we're using it.
Yeah, from the GC perspective, you mostly care about the coordination at the beginning and then at the end, the shop drawings, right? The fabrication. So you need to have all those elements inbuilt to be able to perform that easily. How do you, real quick, how do you measure that? In terms of you've been given a model for coordination, do you have a set standard that you need to provide 300, 350 at the coordination time and then improve it over 400? Do you have a measurement tool that you do?
So we always reference the BIM form spec, and I kind of supplement the definition of the LOD 350 and replace it with a very simple description that's more implicit than explicit. And I say, your scope of work is what you bought out on the job, what you're contracted for. If you don't model it in the model that you provide to us, and it becomes a problem later, then you're responsible for replacing that, to resolving that issue. That usually gets people's attention, and if they want to have a further conversation about it, we definitely can go into a lot of detail on what we expect to see.
Yeah.
So it's not that we're replacing the definition of LOD 350 in the spec. We're referring to it and conveying to them that we don't need every joint in a concrete slab, unless in some way it's going to affect coordination with other trades.
Gotcha. So you just want your sandwich with the cheese and the meat, right? No veggies.
That's right. Exactly.
All right.
No veggies.
Perfect. Thank you, David.
Healthy.
Exactly. Well, I don't know about that. So thanks again for that insight. I think it was great listening from you from what GC perspective goes. I want to switch around to Brian from architecture perspective. That how does as an individual architect, how do you hold yourself on the LODs and how do you work with in terms of if you have to collaborate with other trade, you don't have contractual obligation. How do you hold them accountable to have that LOD if you don't have any of those?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think as an architect, it kind of ties in a lot of what Will and David were already saying. So internally, we have our own processes. And so as the owner, the manager, you make sure that you follow through on what you need. And a lot of that comes down to the purpose of the model. So, is it a design deliverable? Are you delivering the model? Are you passing it on to the owner? Are you passing it on to the contractor? And what is the contractual obligation? So as far as LOD goes, I mean, it's important to have it in a BIM execution plan, and you have a standard that you hold people to. So I mean, there's the internal side, and I mean, generally I say we do LOD 350, just because it's a happy compromise, happy median.
Mm-hmm.
And basically we need to be past the 300 point. We need to coordinate, but kind of what David alluded to is some of those detail elements, especially for fabrication, aren't decided yet, or they could be changed. You could go with one company over another, and depending on the project, if it's a government project, if it's a design build project, if it's a private client, a lot of what I've been doing are luxury residential homes where we are in control of everything, where I can lock something in right away. Hey, we're using this elevator brand or this window brand, and if the client signs off of it in design development, that's what's in the model. As an architect, I try to virtually build the building as much as possible. So if we know for sure this is what we're using, that's what's going in the model. Of course, you have to also manage that with the file size. So a lot of what we'll do, for example, custom elements, I will ask companies if they have 3D models they can share with me if I'm putting something specific in the model. And sometimes it'll be over detailed, so you have to put that on a different work set. But I mean, even as small as furniture, I'll have the exact item in there. So that's exactly right. So even if we do 350, some might be more than that. But then when it comes to consultants, that's another issue for sure. So specifically MEP, I mean, structure for the design side is relatively straightforward, especially when you're talking about concrete. I mean, wood trusses and things like that, that is fabricated later. But as far as concrete slabs and columns and beams, that's pretty straightforward on the design side. But when it comes to MEP, that's always a sticking point. I mean, I've worked with consultants before, and they say, "Oh, we use Revit," and then I have them share their model, and I see that everything's on one plane, and I'm like, okay, that's worthless to me. I can't do clash detection.
That's so, like LOD 0, right?
Exactly. So I think part of that is having a contractual relationship with your consultants, and then also with the owner. I mean, I've had GCs come to me when we're already doing a project, and they say, "Oh, you used Revit for it, and I've heard you talk about BIM and everything. Share your model with us so we can do quantity takeoffs." I have to tell them that was never part of the contractual arrangement. So if I do share anything with you, you're signing a waiver that won't hold us liable for it at all, which is what gets back to Will as far as the legal aspect and the liability, which is extremely important as an architect. And that's why I think it's very important up front to know exactly what the purpose of the model is, and that will affect what I put in it. And if it's for clash detection, if it's for cost, if you're itemizing things off of it, and I mean specifically MEP, I mean light switches and lighting fixtures, things like that. It's very easy to do quantity takeoffs and scheduling from that if things are modeled correctly. If they're not, and you have things floating off in space, it'll be completely wrong. So I think it's setting that up from the beginning and knowing what you're using it for, and then having your internal process, and then also your process working with consultants, and being straightforward with the owners and the GCs as far as what that model is going to be used for. And then if you do turn it over, being clear about that, because I'll say for the most part, many owners have no idea about any of it, and they shouldn't. They should be able to enjoy their lives and not worry about LOD. But it is important as far as what they're paying for and what they're getting, because from LOD 100 to I'll say 500 is very different. And a lot of architects I know will just say we do BIM, and I talk to the other owners, and a lot of them have no idea what BIM actually is or LOD or anything. So you're paying for two different services.
No, yeah, I think that's a great point that you brought, Brian. Is like people don't understand that highest number of LOD doesn't mean that that's the best. You need to know your requirement, what you want out of it, because obviously, like more LODs, like more detail you're putting in, the more money you have to pay, right? So, and just kind of throwing a little bit light on from the subcontractor perspective, that's how we treated LODs in a way that for us, it's mostly, first of all, it's a contractual obligation we have to fulfill, right? If an LOD is provided, but at the same time, we like the owners or the client, the GC, understand it that the LOD you're asking 400, 450 doesn't really suffice at this point from our end, and then we would be charging you way more than what you can do your project in LOD 300. So that's always going to be that area, right? So I think that's a great point that you mentioned.
If I can just add, I mean, exactly what you're speaking to is about being practical and, kind of having common sense. And that's part of working with consultants and also in our internal processes. Hey, think critically, and once you know what the purpose is, and work with people who can understand we're using it for clash detection, or we're using this for takeoffs, or we're just using it for visualization. Yeah. And so, I mean, you can have a BIM execution plan that's 150 pages long that no one reads, it's worthless. So I think it's just having a general idea, hey, 1 is weak, 5 is super detailed and strong, and we're kind of meeting in the middle, and think critically, okay, this is what's important, this is what isn't, and that's what you need a model.
Yeah, and I think we'll have something to add on to it.
Yes, these are great points. There is an LOD matrix in the AIA documents, and I'd recommend everyone look at it. But in summary, there is no LOD of a model. A model is a cocktail, if you will, of elements at different LODs. And 100 is an overall mass where the elements are not formulated for most of the objects in the building. 200 is this is where I consider the element to be born and birthed. It is a distinct object in the model that's approximate. 300 is specific, and the new AIA definitions as of last year clarify that you can measure that object directly from the model without referring to 2D construction documents. And that's a very distinct high bar if you think about it. There are a lot of designers that put elements in models that want you to sign release statements. And they're, so they're not, those elements are not at 300 for the most part, because they would admit to you that they're not, you can't measure that object from the model, set it and put it in the exact right place. It's not the exact right size. 350, I could simplify as saying detailed coordination, and then 400 fabrication. But the big takeaway I think teams should do is look at the AIA LOD matrix, simplify it if you want. I would advocate they use those definitions, particularly if they're in AIA contracts, and that they attach that to their proposals or bid documents. And for designers, we put that LOD matrix in our general notes on the structural and civil engineering sheets we work on, and we put it in our specifications. And we put requirements design side in there on what has to go into the BIM execution plan, so that when trades are bidding on that project, even before GC has the BXP issued, they're seeing what the design team needs to see the trades doing from a BIM perspective. And sometimes we get RFIs and ideas of doing it differently. We're always listening to those. But it's best if the designers on the call look at being proactive in LOD. And main thing is, do not promise a model at a given LOD, because it's a model's a cocktail. And that's a lot of the construction litigation I've seen, is people promising a model and then the objects are at different LODs when delivered.
Yeah, I think
would
that's
wholeheartedly agree with that for sure.
Definitely. Yeah, I think my kind of next question to Will on that same regard was like, so LOD specs, obviously you already explained what 100 to 400 means for right now. And in the past, they were going to 500. Now, I know LODs are like, you have different standards internationally, right? You have LODs for US, and then there are LODs worldwide. So in other countries, they've been throwing those ideas around, like you have LOD 500 still going, and we had LOD 500 before, but now it's been taken out from BIM Forum. So what was the reason for that? And then how would you explain that 500?
So I can give some of the background. And again, I stepped down from leadership at BIM Forum, earlier this year. But historically, when the AGC BIM Forum began the AGC BIM Forum's LOD spec, we had a lot of talks on what to do with 500, and the idea of dealing initially with geometry was the focus. And many in the working groups felt like 500 would eventually go away because once you get into facility management, a heavier weight fabrication model is not always best. And as some of the speakers have already alluded to, the higher number doesn't mean it's a more useful model. It all depends on what your model use case is. And the AGC BIM form LOD spec, and then later after AGC divested itself of BIM forum and the new Philadelphia BIM forum began, both throughout that whole period, LOD 500 we just remained silent on, and the reason is every group kind of has a different view on how they're going to handle facility management. And right now I'm working, over the last few years I've been working on teams on 3 different airport projects, and everyone's talking about digital twins, and we're interacting between our engineering side working on utility coordination and our structural enclosure side working on the overall building and infrastructure. And I could line up 100 people on these 3 different international airport projects, and I think I could get 100 different concept definitions of what a digital twin is.
Yeah.
And what is a digital twin and an LOD 500 element for structure is different than electrical, mechanical, HVAC, enclosures. And so that's why I don't think you would see, I can't speak for the BIM forum anymore, but I don't think you'd see the LOD spec really diving a lot into 500 in that spec. I think BIM forum and other groups will be tackling that facility management digital twin discussion. And that BIM forum will do a great job at it. And there's other groups that are working in this area, internationally. But as far as the AIA definitions, it's in there. We're going to have to address it. But I would recommend teams, if I was looking at what to simplify, be very careful contractually how you deal with LOD 500, because there's a lot of interpretations on what people want for digital twins.
Yeah. That's true. That's true. I think that's the concept has been like thrown around quite a bit, and still in evolution phase where it's going to change a lot. So it makes sense to not have it written down while it's still getting out of the ground. So that's definitely explained. One question, one more I have for you, and maybe David can chime in on that as well. Will, is like on the standards that the companies write, they put LODs, right? So you have LOD 300, 350. But a lot of time they miss out that where to find those LOD, like what specification, I mean, obviously there's so many specification out there, and each one of these are just guidelines. They're not like contracts, but they have to refer to like where to find these LODs, So when they mention it, what is the standard that you would go and look out for those?
So it will all go back to the contracts. And what I would look at, if you've got a building and the design contracts with the owner are AIA contracts, I would recommend going to the AIA definitions as a baseline. Mm-hmm. And then whatever spec you're going to use, there are a number of vintages of the AGC BIM form specs going up to around 2019, and then when AGC divested themselves of BIM forum and the new BIM forum began anew, those versions I think would pick up 2021, 19, 2021. Mm-hmm. That is, BIM forum trajectory, and I think they're working on a new update that'll come out this year. There was no 22 BIM forum. I think they're going to issue a 23. It really goes down to what was the original contracts. And I still see contracts that are written off 08 AIA definitions, mm-hmm. and it had the word accurate at 300. 2013 AIA definitions had the word specific at LOD 300 element. And then 2022 LOD AIA definitions use the word that you can the concept you measure directly from the model. And those are the 3 cardinal definition sets that are out there on United States based projects that I see. And the first thing when there's a construction litigation that you look at is what were the definitions cited. And most of the problems I see are when groups started making up their own stuff.
Yeah.
And it really gets messy when the design with the owner used one set of LOD definitions, the GC uses a different one, and then the trades have their own in their bid documents. I've seen a lot of successful work done with the '08 set, the 2013 AIA definitions, and I see really well written, very clear, very short BIM execution plans with the AIA 2022 LOD definitions. And the hallmark there is people need to read them, know them, and cite them clearly in their contracts for their scope, schedule, and fee. And that's where I would start. Then whatever you do as graphic examples, some GCs have their own, some attach different vintages of either AGC BIM forum or new BIM forums, LOD specs for the graphics. But the main thing is what is in your contract for scope, schedule, and fee related to BIM as it ties into LOD.
And I would agree with that. Also, just to roll it back here, something Will mentioned earlier is the idea of, the purpose of your utilizing LOD or BIM to begin with, being that most of our work is in the multifamily space. A lot of our purpose of doing VDC BIM coordination is simply to achieve a coordinated project for construction. Nothing to do with a record model on the vast majority of our projects. So in our case, our goal is to achieve coordination regardless of the tools utilized to get there. So particularly when I described our LOD 350 guideline to our subcontractors is much less contractual than it is to guide them and what the purpose of our efforts are, that we're, as a GC, we're facilitating coordination that is contractual obligation of the subcontractors. So in our case, there's no, in many cases, there's no spec provided by the owner or even a requirement for utilizing BIM or VDC and coordination on our projects at all. We just see it as a much better way to operate and producing much better end results. So on those projects, and again, around 90-95% of our work, it's something that we're bringing to the table as a service, ultimately to the owner, but not in the form of a record model, in which case we find it much more efficient to reference the specifications for any details or to prompt any questions the subcontractors might have, but with the goal of them providing a model that will be useful for coordination, and we won't end up with conflict out in the field. And as I said before, if they don't model something and it's in their scope and there is a conflict in the field, then they are obligated to resolve that, often at their expense.
Gotcha. So you do mention like what specification to go to, even for an example, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
perfect.
we always reference the BIM form spec as far as the detail that's provided on the vast majority of the 272 pages of it.
Brian, you were saying something.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think this ties in to what Will was saying earlier as far as a model being a cocktail, and that's exactly right, where you have multiple LODs in a model. And so on the design side, I think it's extremely important that you reference an exact spec when you talk about LODs in a contract. I mean, if there's a contract and it doesn't reference an exact source for that, then to me that's a big red flag that these people don't know what they're doing and tread carefully. So I mean, as an architect, you want to be you should be held responsible, but you don't want to overpromise. So I mean, whenever I do stuff, you make sure everything is very clear. because when a contract is written, it's legal, and you want to make sure that it's not ambiguous and it's not vague, and you say this is what it is. I think an internal process is one thing. If I casually say to my guys, hey, I'm all at 350, but when you're talking about a contract with a consultant or with an owner, your contracts need to be tight.
Yeah, that's true. I think Will definitely said to refer to the metrics, and that's the first thing I'm going to do after this call is go and start looking at the metrics and figure out what the LODs are meant for and which area you need to focus on.
Yeah. Well, and I think the trajectory moving forward and the goal here where we want to head, where I see a lot in the industry want to head is the model as the deliverable, and that you're building from the model. And I think this is an interesting time. We've got one thing LOD has historically in the BIM forum vernacular has not addressed is tolerances. And these models are always precise. Objects are precise normally like 15 decimal places, but they could be, inaccurate, give or take a yard. Utility modeling is very different than our, aluminum extrusion to a plus or minus a thousandth of an inch for a snap cover on an extrusion die versus a utility pipe that, is not that tight a tolerance. But yet both modeling platforms will give you measurements to 15 decimal places if you want it. And so that is going to be one of the trends moving forward. And then reality capture is a major one on how that ties in. And Ani, I don't want to give you more work, but I think that could be yet another day you could spend on probably another 3 or 4 days on, reality capture from aerial to terrestrial, and then tolerance, and then tying it back to LOD. What is the difference between approximate and specific?
Yeah,
that's why I advocate on a lot of reality capture work. Do not promise LOD 300, because unless you're doing in-place testing and know what's in like wall cavities, technically you can't deliver LOD 300 reality capture because all you have is surface information. You don't know the core of the wall, for example. And so your spec should be LOD 200 to plus or minus a defined tolerance of your reality capture. So that's a contractual distinction with LOD. I think will simplify a lot of reality capture specs.
Yeah, I think, and that's something up and coming, right? Like in future, because we're going to see a lot of coming, like reality capture with the digital twin coming in right now. You'll see a lot of company focusing heavily on it. So I think that's an interesting area to dive into in future for sure. I want to take a quick moment here for our audience who are listening. If you guys have questions, feel free to start raising your hand and come up to the stage and ask any of us, so any feel free to just jump on while we continue our conversation. So just want to bring that in. One question I do have for you, Will, while we wait for people to jump in on the call is like, where does the LOD stand right now in terms of like, we got so many different organizations doing different stuff, and obviously yourself working on some of the concrete LOD specs. So where it stands and how does the future look like for that? I know it's a broad question, but in your perspective, how does it looks like?
No, it's a great one. I see it really expanding rapidly over the next few years. AIA just released its new definitions. Also, American Concrete Institute in 22 issued their LOD definitions, which took an interesting approach in the concrete arena. Doing some work in the wood industry right now, and they're working this as well as manufactured buildings. And I think what we're finding is the LOD spec, if you will, is a dictionary, and it's providing the common language to write our scope, schedule, and fees and contracts for BIM. But there are regional dialects once you dive into each of these industries. Concrete, if you will, I'm talking about concrete as a destination here. It's got a regional dialect of LOD, and as does the timber, heavy mass timber industry, masonry. There are some tactical items in those, and these industries are having to move forward LOD definitions. And I think what you'll see is everyone's going to tie back. Almost everyone, at least in the U.S. market, is going to tie back to the AIA 2022 definition. But I think you'll start to see a number of white papers, guides, and domain-specific specifications, such as ACI's example last year, because it's ambitious for one single group to feel like they are going to gather each industry feedback. So, and the industries are moving much more rapidly than any one group is controlling right now or keeping up with. And so, but that's a good topic. But I think the trend will be all in the U.S. market will tie back to AIA LOD 2022 definitions.
Okay, perfect. I think we have one question. Apurv Kalal, if you Apurv want to unmute and ask your question, feel free. For some reason, we're not able to hear you, Apurv. I think some microphone issues. So while Apurv figure it out, any other people from the audience, feel free to jump on. If you guys have questions, feel free to add on to or ask questions to any of the panelists. I would kind of just continue the conversation while we wait for the people to jump in terms of like, David, more what's happening from the general contractor perspective. What do you see the future trends like in terms of these, so many definitions coming in and things are getting complicated now? How do you see a better way of resolving these and simplifying it?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's kind of ironic after my last statement there. I just spent all day yesterday looking at a large multifamily project that we're on the verge of award with, and they do have a record model requirement, and a lot of these LOD cross path in the specs that they're having me review. So it's definitely getting more complicated now with multiple specs out there, multiple basic definitions of LOD. And I did want to mention too that another complication in there that's been there from the start really was LOD was already an acronym and very prevalent in 3D modeling before BIM was coined amongst the 3D modelers for mesh and NURBS modeling, and that's for level of detail, which causes a heck of a lot of confusion on the subject to this day. Although due to some of the latest video the graphics card technologies and specifically the Unreal Engine that's converging on our industry more and more, their level of detail seems to be kind of going away with the technology. But the confusion there is that, what we've been talking about here is the level of development, which has impact on not just the geometry, but the information that you collected, as I think Will has touched on quite a bit, is that the different levels of development are just that. They're the evolution of those objects through the design and detailing and awarding and buyout process. So I just thought I'd mention that. Sorry to kind of stray from
No. I think that's great to mention because like LOD, like level of development, it sounds itself as like you're developing something from 100 to 400, right? So it's a whole process that you're going through, and then you have to make sure where you put yourself in the contract that where you stop it, right? So obviously when you start a model, you are doing 100, right? You cannot model directly to 350. You have to model 100, and then you just slowly progress and develop it to go to 350 or 400. So I think that's a great point to mention. Yeah. Apurv, if you're able to open your mic, I don't know if you're still.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are now. Go ahead.
Good evening, gentlemen. My name is Apurv, and I'm a student in infrastructure construction management. I am doing this project regarding comparative analysis offsite steel rebar fabrication and on-site steel rebar fabrication. Basically, offsite is the ready-made steel. So this I came up when I noticed a huge amount of steel rebar being wasted on the construction site during my internship. So as an effort, I want to like simulate the how the construction process with both the things go on, and so my doubt is that how should I proceed with that? Like I should have to make a model in Revit of just concrete and the steel rebar, and then Primavera for schedule, and then Synchro for the simulation of the process.
Okay, so let me reiterate that. I think that question might go to Will, but you're asking that you have an offshore and onshore rebar detailing on the steel modeling you have to do, right?
Right.
And
Not
then
yeah.
and then you don't have
Yeah.
the specs clarified properly. That's what you're saying, and you have to model it in Revit.
No, actually, what is the scene is I'm working on a realistic project as a part of as a part of my MTech thesis. So the building is symmetrical. So half side I am working on the manual, that is the bar bending schedule on site, how the cutting and all will be done. And on the other side there is a software called as BBS Reaper. It's from Germany, where they will detail each every rebar in AutoCAD, and then they will give it for the CNC machine so that it will cut according to the specifications, and then it will be delivered to the site. So
Okay.
what my exact doubt is that in order to simulate the variance in the schedule, I will how should I proceed? Like do a model of the same building in Revit with concrete and steel detailing, and then schedule it with Primavera, and then go for the Synchro 4D simulation.
Okay, Will, do you understand the question? You got the...
I think what would be good in general, this one looks like a very deep dive, and I want to be mindful and get to a lot of questions, and I think we have 5 minutes or so left. What would be good if you could write down your questions and I think send them to Ani?
Yeah, that would be great.
You could go
Yeah,
into,
I can.
there's going to be a perspective of it from design and construction, and I think that'd be the best way to serve that question.
Yeah, Purv, if you
Sorry,
don't
I
mind,
did
just
not
send
get
it.
to whom that to write.
Yeah, to send it
Yeah,
to me. You send it to me, Apurv.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, all right. Thank you.
Oh,
We have Sheikh.
thanks for.
Thanks, Apurv. We got Sheikh as well. We want to take his question, Sheikh, if you have.
Yeah, may I ask?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, yeah. Hello, everyone. Actually, I am doing one professional on BIM professional course. Before that, I was a quantity surveyor. So my question is, if I model something in Revit structure for bar detailing and all, so how much can I detail? Like how much the LOD I can detail on bar and make the quantification from that Revit structure. So could you just elaborate a little bit from this side of view?
If I understand the question is, in structure, maybe how far can you take LODs in Revit?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
How far can I take the LODs?
Okay,
and make the
so that is a good question. That's also a deep dive. And since we're getting into like product specific discussions, let's do that. Send that one in also to Ani offline, because I've been trying to keep these
Yes.
kind of discussions software agnostic. But in general, all design level BIM modeling platforms have matured substantially in the last 5 years in both performance and then the benefits of multi-threading processors and memory utilization. And so without saying good or bad about any of them, they've all gotten much better. And many of them are using what I call 2.5D objects for rebar, meaning there's a very lightweight wireframe representation that then visually renders as a 3D object and runs clash detection. So it looks and feels like a 3D element in the model, but it's actually a very lightweight 2D wireframe element for rebar. And all of them are headed that way. And so the ability to do higher level LOD in what are thought of as traditionally design level modeling platforms has been greatly enhanced over the last 5 years, and I only see it accelerating. So I think all platforms will allow you to go to much higher LODs than we traditionally thought of 5 years ago.
I think that's a great point, because if the software can come to the level where you can model it at certain spec and use it for coordination, that would be your LOD 300 or 350, and then you can keep your other specification for fabrication or all that in separate buckets. I think that will solve a lot of problem, like in terms of what David was saying, coordination wise, you don't really need 500 or 400, so I think having those software would definitely do that. Yeah, again, you can send me that detailed question to me, and I'll refer to it. Okay.
And Ani, I just wanted to add real quickly.
Yes, Brian.
It made me think of it. So traditionally, as far as the accuracy of drawing, so on the architect side, traditionally you had CAD standards where, for example, if you're doing a 1/4-inch scale drawing, you could model, or you could draw up to an 1/8 inch accuracy. It's just national CAD standards as far as what you could actually use an architect's scale for on a printed sheet and see using the scale. And so I think with the change, from hard paper drawings to a digital model, it kind of ties in between the old CAD standards and what you could physically be able to do versus now in a digital world where you can have things, well set to the 15th decimal spaces, but then taking that into account as far as, well, what's the construction tolerance, what do people really build, and being practical about it. So I just wanted to add that as a thought in as far as the traditional level of detail or level of development, so to say, on drawings was controlled by the tools that we had, and those tools have changed.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's definitely another discussion that we can jump into, like where all these softwares are, and in terms of if it relates with LOD or not, But I want to be
another
that would be another great topic to talk about. So, like I said, I want to be mindful of the time. We're hitting right on the clock at 12 here in Eastern, and I think everybody has to go back. And I really appreciate the time Will, David, and Brian took out from their calendar. And for all the listeners as well, like you chimed in and listen, I hope you guys got something out of it. And feel free to send your questions. You can directly DM me those questions, and I'll be able to answer some of them, or get Will or David or Brian involved if I can forward questions too. But thank you, gentlemen, again for the time, and I'm looking forward to doing some of these more, deep dives.
Thank you, Ani. Great job.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
and
everyone.
David, Brian, always great to cross paths.
Agreed. Thanks, Will.
Likewise.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks,
Thank
Brian.
you, guys.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.